The most dangerous people are not the ones carrying secrets. They are the ones who make you question everything you believed was true. That sentence did not make sense to me until the longest night of my life walked through the doors of my emergency room. My name is Emily Carter, and after 15 years as a trauma nurse, I thought I had already seen every version of heartbreak a person could carry. Broken marriages, empty promises, lonely parents, children waiting for miracles that never arrived. 3 months earlier, my husband had packed a suitcase, kissed my forehead like I was a distant relative, and left me with a quiet house that echoed louder than any argument ever had. Since then, I buried myself in 12-hour night shifts because strangers were easier to heal than my own heart. It was a little after 2 o'clock on a rainy Thursday morning when the automatic doors slid open. The emergency department was nearly empty. My coffee had already gone cold, and soft jazz drifted from an old speaker behind the nurse's station. A woman stepped inside alone, wearing a charcoal coat soaked by the rain. She moved with remarkable grace despite obvious exhaustion, one hand pressed carefully against her side. Her silver blonde hair clung to her face in damp strands, and even before I reached her, I noticed something impossible to explain. She looked like someone who had spent her entire life carrying responsibilities nobody else could see. Then her knees weakened. She caught herself against the reception desk before I hurried forward. "Stay with me," I said, slipping one arm around her shoulders. Her pale gray eyes met mine, calm despite everything. "I am trying," she answered quietly. Her voice barely rose above the sound of rain tapping against the glass entrance. I guided her into a treatment room and began the familiar routine. Pulse, blood pressure, breathing. Every movement came naturally, yet she answered almost none of my questions. "Name?" I asked gently. "Vivian." "Last name?" She hesitated for the briefest moment. "That is not important tonight." Before I could press further, bright headlights swept across the treatment room windows. Several dark vehicles rolled into the parking lot with deliberate precision. A moment later, well-dressed men and women entered the hospital. They were calm, respectful, and strangely coordinated. Nobody shouted. Nobody rushed. Yet the atmosphere changed instantly, as though the air itself had become heavier. One older gentleman approached my station with quiet courtesy. "Miss Carter," he said after reading my identification badge. "Thank you for helping Miss Harrington." My heart skipped. Harrington. The name appeared in newspapers often enough that almost everyone in Kentucky recognized it, usually accompanied by rumors, speculation, and headlines about a mysterious business empire led by a woman many people called the Mafia Queen. I looked back toward my patient, expecting fear on her face. Instead, I found resignation. She closed her eyes for only a second before opening them again. "I am sorry you became involved," she whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, the gentleman spoke again, his tone remaining unfailingly polite. "For Miss Harrington's safety, we respectfully ask that you continue her medical care at a private residence. Transportation has already been arranged." Every instinct told me to refuse. Every professional rule told me to stay. Yet when I looked into Vivian's tired eyes, I saw something completely unexpected. She was not asking to be rescued. She looked like a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to hope someone might choose to stay. The drive through the rain lasted nearly an hour, although it felt much longer because nobody explained where we were going. I sat beside Vivian in the back seat, my medical bag resting on my knees while the windshield gathered thousands of shimmering raindrops beneath the passing streetlights. She leaned her head lightly against the window, her breathing slow and controlled, as though she had spent years teaching herself never to let discomfort become visible. Every few minutes I glanced toward her without meaning to. She always seemed composed, yet there was an unmistakable exhaustion around her eyes that no amount of confidence could hide. I had spent my career recognizing silent suffering. Hers was unlike anything I had ever seen. The city slowly disappeared behind us until iron gates emerged from the darkness. They opened without hesitation, revealing a long tree-lined driveway leading toward an elegant stone estate overlooking a wide river. It looked nothing like the fortress I had imagined. Warm lights glowed from every window, flower gardens framed the entrance despite the rain, and soft music drifted through the open doorway as though someone had been expecting family instead of strangers. Before I could gather my thoughts, A middle-aged woman hurried toward us carrying clean towels instead of questions. "Miss Harrington, you are freezing," she said gently before turning to me with an equally warm smile. "You must be Miss Carter. Thank you for coming." I had expected suspicious stares. Instead, I was welcomed with kindness that felt strangely ordinary. Inside, someone prepared fresh tea while another person quietly brought me additional medical supplies without my asking. No one spoke in whispers. No one acted afraid of Vivian. They treated her with the familiar affection usually reserved for someone they deeply respected. I followed Vivian into a private sitting room where a fireplace filled the air with the comforting scent of cedar wood. As I carefully examined her condition again, she watched the dancing flames instead of watching me. "You did not have to come," she said softly. "Neither did you," I answered while adjusting a fresh bandage. A faint smile appeared for only a moment before disappearing again. "Fair enough." As I worked, I noticed several old scars across her shoulder and forearm, faded enough to belong to another chapter of her life. They were not fresh, but they told stories no medical chart could explain. Without thinking, I quietly asked, "Who stayed beside you when these happened?" Her eyes lifted immediately, meeting mine with unmistakable surprise. She remained silent for several seconds before speaking almost in a whisper. "No one has ever asked me that before." I realized then that I had not asked who caused the scars. I had asked who cared afterward. The difference settled gently between us like another heartbeat in the room. Housekeeper entered carrying homemade chicken soup and warm bread, placing the tray beside Vivian with the tenderness of an older sister. After she left, I looked around the room once more. Family photographs filled the bookshelves. Fresh flowers stood beside every window. Nothing matched the frightening image I had carried in my mind. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing louder since the hospital. "Who are you when nobody is reading the headlines?" Vivian wrapped both hands around the warm bowl without taking a bite. She looked into the fire before quietly answering, "I have spent so many years surviving the stories other people wrote about me that I almost forgot the answer myself." For the first time that night, I stopped seeing the woman the world feared. I simply saw someone who looked incredibly tired of being misunderstood. Morning arrived with a pale golden light spilling across the river, and for a brief moment I forgot I had fallen asleep in a guest room inside the home of the woman newspapers had spent years turning into a legend. Then I opened my eyes, saw the neatly folded sweater someone had left outside my door along with fresh coffee, and remembered exactly where I was. I walked downstairs expecting awkward silence. Instead, I found the kitchen alive with ordinary conversations. A young chef argued playfully with an elderly gardener over the best way to bake apple pie. Someone laughed in the hallway. Fresh bread cooled beside an open window while the scent of cinnamon drifted through the house. It felt less like an empire and more like a family. Vivian was standing on the back terrace overlooking the river, wrapped in a light cream sweater with a mug of tea warming her hands. Without the rain and exhaustion from the previous night, she looked younger than I first thought, although the sadness in her gray eyes remained unchanged. "You should still be resting," I reminded her as I approached with my medical bag. She smiled without looking away from the water. "You have said that 3 times in less than 12 hours. Because it is still true. You are surprisingly difficult to ignore." "I hear that often." She laughed quietly, and the sound seemed unfamiliar even to her. While checking her pulse and changing the bandages once again, I noticed her condition had already improved. She thanked me every single time I adjusted the dressing, something I rarely heard from patients who were used to giving orders. "Does everyone here thank each other this much?" I asked with a smile. Vivian looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would we not?" Before I could answer, a little girl ran across the garden carrying a basket of freshly picked flowers. She could not have been older than 8. She stopped in front of Vivian with complete confidence. "Miss Vivian, these are for the dining room." Vivian knelt carefully despite my immediate look of disapproval, and accepted the flowers as though receiving something priceless. "They are beautiful, Lily. Thank you." The little girl hugged her without hesitation before running back toward the greenhouse. I watched the entire exchange in silence. "She lives here?" I finally asked. Vivian nodded. "Her mother manages the gardens. After her father passed away, they stayed because this has always been home." Throughout the morning I followed Vivian as she slowly returned to her routine. She visited the greenhouse to ask about the vegetable harvest, checked on an elderly employee recovering from knee surgery, and spent nearly 20 minutes helping the groundskeeper solve a crossword puzzle that had defeated him since breakfast. Nobody lowered their voice when she entered a room. Nobody seemed intimidated. They disagreed with her. They teased her. They smiled because she smiled. Every story I had ever heard about Vivian Harrington began quietly falling apart, replaced by moments too ordinary to be manufactured. That afternoon I wandered into the library searching for a medical reference book, and instead found shelves filled with handwritten letters tied together by faded blue ribbon. Curiosity won before caution could stop me. The first letter thanked Vivian for paying for a child's cancer treatment. Another described a scholarship that allowed a young woman to become the first doctor in her family. A third thanked her for rebuilding a community clinic after severe flooding. I looked up just as Vivian entered the room. She noticed the letters in my hands but never asked me to put them away. She simply smiled with quiet sadness and said, "Kindness has a strange habit of staying invisible when people have already decided who you are." The following morning carried the sweet scent of lavender through the open windows, and for the first time in months I woke without immediately reaching for the loneliness that had become part of my routine. I told myself I was only staying because Vivian still needed medical supervision, yet every hour I remained inside the estate made that explanation feel a little less convincing. After breakfast I found her sitting beneath a large maple tree overlooking the river, with a hardcover novel resting unopened on her lap. She looked up as I approached with fresh bandages and smiled with the quiet familiarity of someone who had already begun expecting my footsteps. "You are becoming predictable," she said gently. "So are you," I answered while taking her pulse. "Every morning you pretend you are stronger than yesterday." She laughed softly. "Perhaps because every morning you remind me that I am not." Her recovery continued exactly as I hoped. The wound was healing well, her breathing remained steady, and the color had finally returned to her face. As I carefully replaced the bandage, my eyes drifted across several older scars scattered along her shoulder and upper arm. They were different from the ones I had noticed before. Some were thin, others barely visible beneath the sunlight. Each one hinted at years that no newspaper had ever described. "Do they still hurt?" I asked quietly. Vivian followed my gaze before answering. "Only when I remember why they happened." There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. Before I could ask another question, Mrs. Eleanor slowly crossed the garden carrying a basket of tomatoes from the greenhouse. Vivian stood immediately to help despite my disapproving expression. She took the basket without hesitation and matched the older woman's slow pace all the way back to the kitchen. They talked about recipes, weather, and whether the roses would bloom again before autumn arrived. Nothing about the conversation resembled the life I had imagined for someone surrounded by so many rumors. Later that afternoon I wandered through the greenhouse while waiting for Vivian to finish a meeting with her accountant. Lily was carefully watering rows of herbs with complete concentration. "Miss Vivian says plants grow better when people speak kindly to them," she explained with complete confidence. I smiled. "Do you believe her?" Lily looked at me as though the answer should have been obvious. "She believes it. That is enough for me." Her words stayed with me long after she skipped away toward the vegetable beds. That evening the rain returned, tapping gently against the windows while the electricity flickered once before settling again. I found Vivian standing beside an old piano in the library. "Do you play?" I asked. She rested her fingertips lightly across the polished wood. "My mother taught me when I was little. After she passed away I stopped." I sat quietly on the nearby sofa. "Maybe the piano has been waiting for you." She hesitated before pressing a single key. One soft note floated through the room, followed by another, until a simple melody slowly filled the silence between us. I watched her more than I listened to the music. The guarded woman who had first walked into my emergency room seemed to disappear with every gentle note. When the song ended, neither of us spoke immediately. Finally she looked toward me with a smile touched by both gratitude and vulnerability. "You have a remarkable gift," she whispered. "You make people feel safe enough to remember who they used to be." Somehow, without realizing when it happened, I had begun hoping she might remember that woman forever. The peaceful rhythm of the estate slowly became part of my own heartbeat, and somewhere between morning coffee on the terrace and evening walks through the gardens, I stopped counting the days until I would leave. Instead, I found myself memorizing the sound of the river outside Vivian's window, and the way she always paused to greet every employee by name. She never hurried past anyone. She asked about families, remembered birthdays, and noticed when someone looked tired before they admitted it themselves. It was impossible to reconcile that woman with the stories printed in newspapers. One cool afternoon, heavy clouds gathered unexpectedly, while we wandered through the orchard behind the greenhouse. The air smelled of fresh apples and damp earth, and the wind carried the promise of another autumn storm. "We should head back," I said, looking toward the darkening sky. Vivian tilted her face toward the breeze with a quiet smile. "You always know when the weather is about to change. Years of walking patience to their cars in every season." She laughed softly. "Then I suppose I should trust your experience." We had barely reached the old glass conservatory when the rain arrived, first as a gentle whisper and then as a steady curtain that blurred the gardens into soft shades of green. We stepped inside together, surrounded by rows of blooming orchids, fragrant herbs, and climbing white roses. Warm humidity wrapped around us while raindrops danced across the glass roof overhead. I found 2 clean towels folded on a nearby bench and handed one to Vivian. As she reached for it, our fingers brushed for the briefest moment. Neither of us pulled away immediately. The touch was innocent, almost accidental, yet it lingered in the quiet space between us far longer than it should have. She lowered her eyes with a small smile that seemed both shy and surprised. "Thank you," she whispered. "You keep saying that," I replied, "because you keep giving me reasons to." We walked slowly through the conservatory, stopping beside a row of white roses climbing toward the ceiling. Vivian gently touched one blossom with the back of her fingers. "My mother planted these before she became sick," she said. "She believed roses bloom best when they have something strong to hold on to." I looked at the vines winding carefully around their supports and realized the words carried more meaning than flowers alone. "Maybe people are not so different," I said quietly. She turned toward me, her gray eyes searching mine with a softness I had never seen before. "Perhaps they are not." The rain continued falling outside, sealing us inside that peaceful world for a little while longer. We spoke about childhood memories, favorite books, and the places we had always wanted to visit but never had. For the first time since my divorce, I laughed without forcing it. For the first time in what looked like many years, Vivian laughed without looking over her shoulder first. As the storm slowly faded into mist, neither of us rushed toward the door. We simply stood beside the roses, listening to the last raindrops slide down the glass, both quietly realizing that the safest place either of us had found in years was no longer a building. It was the quiet company of the woman standing beside us. 3 more days passed so quietly that I almost forgot I had another life waiting beyond the estate gates. Every morning began with coffee on the east terrace where the river reflected the pale autumn sky, and every evening ended with long conversations that somehow made the hours disappear without either of us noticing. I had spent years believing healing happened inside hospital rooms. Vivian quietly proved that sometimes healing began with someone remembering how you liked your tea, or asking how you slept instead of pretending everything was fine. Her strength returned steadily, and although she no longer needed constant medical attention, she never once suggested that I should leave. She simply found small reasons for us to spend another hour together. One afternoon, while I was updating my medical notes in the library, a distinguished gentleman entered the room and politely informed Vivian that several important investors had arrived unexpectedly. His tone remained calm, yet I immediately sensed the atmosphere shifting. Vivian looked toward me with quiet apology. "I will not be long," she said before following him toward the main hall. Curiosity eventually drew me onto the second-floor balcony overlooking the entrance below. 4 elegantly dressed visitors stood waiting beside the grand staircase. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody appeared threatening. Still, the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Vivian greeted each person with calm confidence, listening carefully before responding with only a few measured words. What surprised me most was not her authority but the respect she earned without demanding it. She never interrupted anyone. She never spoke louder than necessary. Even disagreements remained remarkably civil. Then one of the visitors glanced upward and noticed me standing on the balcony. The conversation stopped. Every face turned in my direction. For a single uncomfortable moment, I wished I had stayed inside my room. Vivian followed their gaze before speaking with complete certainty. Miss Carter is my guest, she said calmly. She deserves the same courtesy you have shown me. Without hesitation, every visitor nodded in quiet agreement. The meeting concluded only minutes later, and the estate slowly returned to its familiar peace. That evening I found Vivian sitting alone beside the river with 2 cups of hot tea waiting on the small wooden table between us. She looked tired, though not physically. It was the exhaustion of someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities nobody else fully understood. I sat beside her without speaking. After a long silence, she smiled faintly. You have questions? I always have questions. Then ask. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug before looking toward the water. Why did you protect me in front of them? Vivian watched the gentle current for several seconds before answering. Because somewhere along the way, protecting you became more important than protecting my reputation. The honesty in her voice stole every prepared response I thought I had. I searched her face for calculation, for obligation, for anything that suggested she had rehearsed those words. I found none. There was only quiet sincerity, carried gently by the evening breeze. Neither of us reached for the other's hand. Neither of us spoke about feelings we were only beginning to understand. Yet as the sun disappeared beyond the trees, I realized the distance between us had changed without either of us noticing. It was no longer built from suspicion or obligation. It was built from trust, and trust had quietly become something I was no longer willing to lose. The following weekend arrived wrapped in brilliant autumn sunshine, and Vivian surprised me with a simple invitation. Come into town with me, she said while pouring coffee into 2 travel mugs. You have spent enough time behind these gates. We drove along quiet country roads lined with crimson maple trees until the estate disappeared behind us. The small riverside town felt warm and familiar, the kind of place where people still greeted one another by name. What surprised me most was not that everyone recognized Vivian. It was the way they smiled when they did. An elderly bookstore owner insisted she take home the latest novel from a favorite author. A young teacher thanked her for helping renovate the elementary school library years earlier. Lily's mother stopped to introduce us to neighbors as though there were nothing unusual about the woman standing beside me. Every conversation quietly erased another rumor I had once believed. On our way home, Vivian suggested we stop at a scenic overlook where the river curved between rolling hills painted gold by the afternoon light. The breeze carried the scent of pine and fallen leaves while birds drifted lazily across the water below. We stood together without speaking until Vivian reached into the pocket of her coat and removed a small photograph protected inside a clear sleeve. I found this while organizing old family records, she said softly before handing it to me. The moment I looked at it, the world seemed to stop moving. A younger Vivian stood beside a smiling physician wearing a white laboratory coat. I knew that smile. I knew those kind eyes. I knew the way he tilted his head toward the camera. My hands began trembling before I could stop them. Where did you get this? I whispered. Vivian looked at me with quiet confusion. He cared for my family for many years. I could barely breathe. That is my father. The words hung between us with crushing weight. Vivian's expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief. Your father was Dr. Michael Carter? I nodded without taking my eyes off the photograph. Memories rushed back all at once. My mother's tears after his sudden death. The unanswered questions that haunted every holiday. The whispered conversations that always stopped when I entered the room. People had spent years saying he became involved with dangerous people before he died. I looked up at Vivian, my heart struggling to reconcile the woman I had come to trust with the mystery that had shaped my entire life. You knew him, I said quietly. Yes, she answered, her voice almost breaking. Why did you never tell me? She lowered her eyes, taking a slow breath before speaking. Because I did not know who you were until I found his photograph in the library records yesterday. I was trying to understand why you seemed so familiar. Every peaceful morning, every shared conversation, every quiet smile suddenly collided with years of buried grief. My heart wanted to believe the woman standing before me. My memories demanded answers she could not yet give. I stepped backward, still holding the photograph against my chest. Vivian did not reach for me. She did not defend herself. She simply stood beneath the endless autumn sky with sorrow written across her face, watching the distance between us grow wider than either of us had ever imagined. I packed my bag before sunrise because staying any longer felt impossible. Every room inside the estate carried a memory I no longer trusted. The library where we had laughed over old novels. The terrace where morning coffee had slowly softened the loneliness inside both of us. The greenhouse where rain had turned silence into something comforting. Now every beautiful memory stood beside one impossible question. Had the woman I was beginning to love also been connected to the greatest loss of my life? Mrs. Eleanor found me standing in the front hallway with my coat already on. She looked at the suitcase beside my feet before quietly wrapping a loaf of fresh bread in a linen towel and placing it into my hands. Some people only understand the truth after they have walked away from it, she whispered. I thanked her, but my voice barely existed anymore. As I reached the front door, Vivian appeared. She looked as though she had not slept at all. There were no guards around her, no advisors, no careful distance. Only a woman carrying more regret than words could ever describe. She stopped several feet away, respecting the space I had chosen to create between us. I will not ask you to stay, she said gently. Not until you know everything. She extended a weathered leather folder toward me. Your father trusted me with this many years ago. I promised I would only give it to his family when the time was right. I accepted the folder without opening it. Why did he trust you? I asked quietly. Vivian lowered her eyes for a long moment before answering. Because he believed people deserved to be judged by the choices they made, not by the stories written about them. I left without saying goodbye. The drive back to my apartment felt longer than the night I first traveled to the estate. My home looked exactly as I had left it, yet it somehow felt smaller than before. That evening I finally opened the leather folder. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and one sealed envelope with my father's familiar handwriting across the front. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. Emily, if this reaches you, then life has finally revealed the truth I hoped you would one day discover. Vivian Harrington did not destroy my life. She spent years protecting people whose names the world will never know, including mine. The danger never came from her. It came from those who wanted compassion to disappear because it stood in the way of power. If you ever meet her, please remember this before believing anyone else's version of our story. Tears blurred the page until the words dissolved into soft gray shapes. Everything I had believed since childhood began quietly collapsing beneath my father's own voice. Before I could gather my thoughts, my phone rang. The unfamiliar caller spoke only one calm sentence before ending the call. If you care about Vivian, tell her not to sign the foundation papers this morning. I stared at the silent phone, my heartbeat echoing through the empty apartment. I did not know exactly what she intended to surrender, but I suddenly understood one undeniable truth. While I had been questioning whether Vivian deserved my trust, she had already decided to give up the life she had built so that I could inherit a future untouched by the burdens she had carried alone. The next morning I drove back to the estate with my father's letter resting on the passenger seat beside me, and for the first time since leaving, I was no longer chasing answers. I was following the truth. The familiar iron gates stood open as though they had been waiting all along. The mansion looked different in the early sunlight. Not because it had changed, but because I finally had. Mrs. Eleanor welcomed me with tears shining in her eyes before quietly pointing toward the garden overlooking the river. She is there, she whispered. I found Vivian standing beneath the old maple tree where we had shared so many quiet mornings. A neat stack of legal documents rested on the wooden table beside two untouched cups of coffee. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and surprise softened the sadness she had been carrying. Emily, she said almost inaudibly. I stopped only a few feet away. I read my father's letter. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though she had been holding her breath for days. Then you know. I nodded slowly. He trusted you because you chose compassion when it was easier to choose fear. Vivian glanced toward the papers on the table. Everything has been signed. The businesses that can serve people honestly now belong to an independent charitable foundation. The estate will become a community health and education center. The old life ends today. I looked at her in disbelief. You gave away everything. She smiled gently, The same quiet smile that had first unsettled my heart in the emergency room. Not everything. I simply stopped holding on to the things that never truly belonged to me. My eyes filled before I realized I was crying. You were willing to let me leave forever. Vivian met my gaze with complete honesty. Love cannot ask someone to stay before they are free to choose. The words settled deep inside me. I stepped forward until only a breath remained between us. This time it was I who reached for her hand. She accepted it carefully, as though holding something precious that could still disappear. The warmth felt familiar, peaceful, and wonderfully certain. 1 year later, the estate had become exactly what Vivian imagined. Children laughed in classrooms that once hosted formal meetings. The greenhouse supplied fresh vegetables for local families. A community health clinic bearing my father's name welcomed anyone who needed care regardless of their circumstances. I returned to full-time nursing, surrounded by people who reminded me every day why kindness mattered. Vivian devoted her mornings to scholarships, local charities, and tending the white roses her mother planted decades earlier. Every evening we carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the terrace overlooking the river, watching the sunset color the water in shades of gold and amber. We rarely needed many words anymore because peace has its own language. Sometimes Lily still brought flowers from the garden. Mrs. Eleanor still insisted everyone eat another slice of pie. The piano in the library was no longer silent. Vivian played every Sunday afternoon, and I always listened from the doorway with the same quiet smile. Looking back now, I understand that healing did not begin the night I met Vivian. It began the moment I found the courage to question the stories I had inherited. The heart finds its truest home not by escaping the past, but by choosing kindness when the future finally offers a second chance.